Okay, good morning again. Welcome back to social psychology. Today we will be talking about intergroup behavior. The topics that we discuss are relevant also for the issue that we covered last week, prejudice. And I would like to start with a small exercise with you. I would like to get everyone with brown eyes standing up, please. Okay. So I would like you to be the disadvantaged group today. You are not allowed to sit down, and you are not allowed to ask me any questions. Everyone with blue eyes, green eyes, gray eyes can ask me questions as usual. And please relax. Let's first discuss the questions from last week. No, please. You have to get the feeling. I mean, prejudice in social psychology refers to an unfavorable attitude towards others, a bad experience with some people, an inborn fear of strange people, a comment that can be used in court. People with brown eyes, of course, cannot participate. Yes, please. And 100% got this one right. The first time. I don't know, it was some 30 plus, 32 or 33 when I looked into it last time, maybe a few more. There's evidence that when a woman experiences a tire puncture on a busy road, she can expect to receive reasonably prompt aid. This is likely to be due to women's incompetence, the way she dresses, male chauvinism, or sex stereotyping. Yes, please.
Sex stereotyping.
Correct, and 86%, so the vast majority got this one right. Okay, and now I would like to stop the exercise. Students with brown eyes, please sit down again. How did it feel? How did you feel when I said you are not allowed to participate?
It's not a good feeling.
It's not a good feeling. How did you feel, or what did you think?
Not good.
How did the others feel? How did you observe someone standing next to you just because of the color of his eye?
Awkward, and I perceived it as completely unnecessary. I think I would just have sit down. But obviously nobody of the ones standing did it. So
He tried to sit down, and I mean, I didn't.
Yeah, but maybe that's because I was in the majority and not disadvantaged group, and I was thinking it's completely unnecessary. And why did you do that? And the others probably felt like I must because I'm minority and I just can't sit down. It's the only person in the room. So
Yes, please.
I didn't like it either because due to his standing up, I couldn't see. So
Okay.
his disadvantage impacted on me, and I wasn't okay with that.
Yeah. This exercise was a small example of a training that Jane Elliott, who was an American, or she's still alive, she's an American school teacher, and in the 1960s she experienced some really strong statement of racism in her students' classes, and she thought about a way of getting the students feel how the black the black minority students felt then when they were discriminated against and when they heard prejudice by others. And she developed a training program that was called Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes training. And she separated people simply on the color of their eyes. And she singled out the blue-eyed students as a disadvantaged group. And for example, one thing she was doing was she was telling the blue eye and brown eye students that people with blue eyes have blue eyes because of their genetic makeup, but that this genetic makeup would also influence their intelligence. And students with blue eyes would typically get slightly lower grades in intelligence tests. And to prove that, she prepared some sort of a intelligence test like the one we would be using, but she manipulated one factor. The students with blue eyes had to wait for an hour in a really small room without any water. It was hot, they were feeling uncomfortable, and they were feeling under stress when they came into the room where they took the test. The students with brown eyes sat in a relaxed atmosphere and discussed some of the items as sample questions with the teacher before. So they were prepared for the test, they already knew answers to some of the items. Then they took the test, and then Jane Elliott revealed the results and could indeed show that the blue-eyed students were performing less good on this test, which reinforced the stereotype that the blue-eyed students, as she had said before, were less intelligent than brown-eyed students. And when you do that for a couple of hours, the blue-eyed students start feeling not only disadvantaged because of the experiment, but disadvantaged because they were a less worthy group. And the brown-eyed students started bossing and making negative comments to the other students. And after a day, she swapped roles. So this course also involves being in the majority or in the minority at different stages. I think this is a great example of how we can educate people, not only by giving lectures and materials, but making people feel what it means to be in a privileged group or in a disadvantaged group. Thank you for participating. If it is only 5 minutes or 2 minutes, but I think it gives us extremely important insights. Terms such as regressive racism, modern racism, and symbolic racism refer to a concern for the rights of minorities or a concern for the rights of ethnic majorities, a conflict between egalitarian values and a deep antipathy towards racial outgroups, or hatred of the majority group. Yes, please.
It's C.
It's a conflict between egalitarian values and a deep antipathy, and 77% got this one correct. This was probably a little bit more tricky. We can detect modern forms of racism by using Thurston or Likert scales, unobtrusive measures, structured interviews, or double-blind designs. Yes, please. Unobtrusive measures. I don't know why, but only slightly half of the students got this one right. We typically use Thurston or Likert scales to explicitly measure people's attitudes, such as prejudice. And we discussed last week that on many of these scales and in surveys, blatant racism is on the decline. But on the other hand, we may wonder whether this is really reflecting a deep, fundamental change in people's attitudes towards more positive feelings about the minority groups or not. And unobtrusive measures help us to detect these modern forms. So we observe people behaving, we do the types of discrimination experiments I showed you that Klink and Wagner have done. We can use the IAT and many other things that will help us understand that some people have some residual racism or modern racism or subtle prejudice, etc. Any questions to this item or other questions? Okay. I also asked you the question on the MOOC forum. What do you think about a quota for female managers on company boards or other top leadership positions? Just last week we had a colloquium and the student presenting there showed us the most recent figures. About 30% or 50% of the whole workforce in Germany is female. 30% of leadership positions are by females, held by females, but only 3% of top leadership positions, that is company executive and advisory board, are held by women. And you know that we have this discussion at the moment that for advisory boards and top leadership positions, shall we have a quota or not? Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is having a quota not like discrimination against
Men?
I mean, it's just, it's enforcing something because you don't believe that people can do it on their own.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think some of the discussion, the contributions in the discussions were positive, some were negative. I think introducing the quota would certainly have a positive effect on female participation in leadership positions and responsible positions. Norway introduced the quota for advisory boards in 2001 or 2. After industry promised to do something about the problem themselves, for 5 years, and nothing changed. The government, which was a conservative government at that time, introduced a quota of 40% of females in advisory boards, and a year later this 40% was accomplished, and this has positive economic effects on the Norwegian industry. But many people are against the quota. One argument would be it is discriminating against men. Another argument, however, would be it also discriminates against women, because if they get leadership positions and there's a quota, they may feel, or others may perceive them as only have gotten this position because of the quota and not because of her own qualifications. And my argument is that a quota helps, and as long as we don't have any governmental regulations, I'm very skeptical that anything would change, because as long as predominantly male people in the boards of companies make the decisions, change would be far too slow. So we need something like quota systems and incentives, but we have to implement quotas wisely. I knew the CIO of Deutsche Telekom, for example, and you may remember 3 or 4 years ago, René Obermann introduced a 30% quota for the whole of Telecom, and the CIO, Chief Information Officer, who was responsible for the IT systems, he said, this is not working for the IT sector. This may work in marketing, this may work in sales, this may work in production, in general headquarters, etc., where you have roughly 50% female people. But in IT, for example, you have fewer than 10% people who are female on the shop floor, and it's very difficult to get a 30% quota unless you would promote people, female employees who are not qualified. So I think what we need is something like a cascading system, and we do have that here in our university. We have a gender equality plan for our university, and this gender equality plan says you should always aim for a number that represents the number on the next lower level. So for example, in psychology, as you know, we have about 70–75% female students. So our target for PhD students should also be around 70%, which we achieve. We have slightly fewer PhD students who complete. That means we have about 60–65% female PhDs, and that is a quota for female habilitations and junior professorships. At the moment, we have about 30 or 40% female habilitations and junior professorships, and that should be the quota for the next level, for professorships. If you look at, I don't know, physics, the quotas would be different. So one quota, one single quota for every department would not work, at least not in the short term. This is one thing. And the other thing, colleagues of mine in Marburg, Ulrich Wagner and Anke Schmermund, have conducted some experiments about 10 years ago, where they presented little scenarios, little vignettes to people. And what they found was that quotas are accepted as long as performance is the #1 criterion. So you can always say, we look for the best candidate, but if we have two equal candidates in terms of performance qualifications, then we take the women until we have accomplished our quota. So these things need to go together, and if everyone would consider quota or not, performance is the one criterion to which we appoint or promote people, then we would not so easily have the negative effects of quotas. I don't know, do you agree or?
Not really. I don't know. I mean, a quota is just, I don't think that it really helps to just promote somebody because you need a quota. I mean, the best person should do the job, and if it's man, I mean, I don't see the point why women should be better in leading positions. It's just, I'm not really convinced of that. So.
Yes. Do you want to comment on this? Oh.
Maybe a quote is not like a solution for eternity, but it's nice to mix the system up. And so, because when there are like 40% women in leadership positions, then they can promote other women far more better than now.
I think this is a very good point. I mean, today, many companies, many of the DAX 30 companies try to have one token women on the board, but one doesn't help a lot. Some research has found that there needs to be some critical mass. You need to have 2 or 3 women to change the culture or climate in an organization, and also to have enough role models for women lower in the hierarchy to see, oh, it works. Yes?
Yeah, but you used the word helping. Why women doesn't help, but why would it be better to have more women? I mean, it's just, I'm not really convinced of that. Why is a board of more women that decide better than a board of men? I mean, maybe for some companies men are better, and for some others women are better. I mean,
Thank you. Do you want to comment? It's interesting. You take the position that typically men take, and the male students seem to defend a quota system. Or I don't know what you.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's about women being better, but it's about equality. If there are 40 or 50% women in the society, why shouldn't 40 or 50% women be working in top leadership positions?
Let me just comment on this very briefly. In the social psychology and management literatures, there are 2 main models that are always presented when we talk about quota systems, not only for men and women, but also for ethnic minorities and other disadvantaged groups. One is the business case model. The business case model would argue we need more representation of minorities because this helps us with performance. If we have more diverse perspectives in a board, for example, because people have different backgrounds, have made different experiences, this helps make better decisions. There are 2 problems with this business case model. The first problem is, what do you do if you are in an environment or in a situation where you don't need many perspectives? Sometimes there is not a good argument. It's difficult to find a good argument why many perspectives would help. Would you kick out the minorities in that situation, or what would you do? This is the argument in Germany, for example, with the guest workers. At the moment, we, again, like in the 60s, seem to be in demand of people immigrating to Germany because we don't have enough autochthon Germans providing enough workforce. But what would we do if the situation changes again in 10 years' time? Do we throw out the foreigners coming here for work again, like we have tried in the 70s and 80s? And the second problem with the business case model is there is no conclusive evidence that diversity is really improving companies' performance. There are some studies that show, yes, it does help, it contributes to better decision making, it contributes to company success, but there are other studies that show just the opposite pattern, and there are many studies who don't find any relationship. Diversity is a very diverse concept. It depends on the form of diversity. Are we talking about gender? Are we talking about age? Are we talking about ethnic group, etc., etc.? There are many outcome variables that you can look at. If you look, for example, at variables like conflict, team cohesion, team identification, these variables are typically negatively affected by more diversity, because typically we like people who are similar to us and not people who are diverse. If you look at decision-making quality also, sometimes we find more positive effects. So this is a problem with the business case model, but I still think it's good to put forward the business case model whenever we have good arguments for it. because this sometimes also helps convincing people who are typically more critical of the other model, and the other model would be the equality model. We all deserve the same chances and opportunities, and when there's a 50% representation of whatever group, take females, 50% representation of female workers or students or PhDs in a university, then where's the argument why we should not also have about 50% female professors? Some aspects that have led to the situation of, I think Goethe University has about 20% female professors on average, but that's varying from 40% in educational sciences, 30% in psychology, down to no single female professor in some departments. And some of it is because of preferences. Some subjects are not taken by women so often. Some women don't want to become professors or leaders. We show this in our research that there's a difference in leadership motivation between men and women. But a lot also has to do with historic reasons, and this means discrimination. And when it's always the same old boys networks that make the decision and promote people who are similar to them, not because they are overt sexists, not because they have a strategy to do so, but because they tend to get along better with people who are similar to them. So there's a constant self-fulfilling prophecy or self-reinforcing system. And I think the quota would be one instrument to break this up a little bit. Yes, please.
Yeah, but I personally would feel really bad if I was just a quota woman. You know,
Yeah,
I would always feel less than the men working with me, and that is not the point of it.
Yeah. No, but that's what I just said. I think performance should be the #1 criterion, because that would then not also negatively impact on women. So if we make this a clear standard, that in every job, of course, the performance would be the #1 criterion. This is something that helps, for example, with blind applications. The telecom, for example, has also experimented with this. So from the first page of the application, from the application pack, the first page is taken off that reveals people's sex, age, and ethnic group. And this already leads to more female, older applicants and people from minority ethnic groups being invited to the next stage of the recruitment procedure. And when they sit down face to face with the people who do the interviews and who decide who to appoint, they are already one step further and can show how good they are or how they would solve a problem. This is already one small thing that helps, and even this is fiercely opposed by some organizations. And I think this is a good example of that we sometimes have to force organizations. Sometimes when I give public talks about this issue, I compare this with the seat belt. In the 70s, when I was a boy, many cars did already have seat belts, but no one used them. My father's arguments were always, oh, if the car would turn over, I would not get out of the car. Many people had different excuses for not using the seatbelt. And then at the end of the 1970s, the penalty of 20 Deutschmarks was introduced for people not taking on their seatbelt. And all of a sudden, it was like 95% compliance with that rule. And it had helped to introduce a norm that it's good and right to take on your seatbelts. At that time, my father didn't have a bad conscience when no one in the car was using a seatbelt. When I'm sitting in the car now, my little boy in the back would make a negative comment, and I would have a negative conscience. And this is one example of how this negative incentive helped changing a norm in society. Yes, please.
Yeah, but that is proven positive. I mean, using a seatbelt has been proven to be better than not using it. And this, you just said that this has not been proven with women.
It has not been shown, or unfortunately, there is little evidence that more women on boards of companies or in leadership positions really lead to more productivity and more profits. But it's also this also means that the opposite is also true. It has never been shown that more women impede companies' performance, so why should there be an argument of employing fewer women than on every lower hierarchy? Maybe.
I have another idea. I think we should use more social media. For example, when we have a lot of articles in newspaper about women in top positions, then the companies could think, when we have a lot of ladies in our top positions, then we are in the newspaper and everybody knows that we are very good and modern companies, though perhaps it could work on another way.
Yeah, thank you. This is, I mean, for company strategy or marketing reasons, it may help, but it also helps young girls and young women seeing other women as role models. This is exactly what we tried over the last 2 years in a project with Alina Hernandez-Bark. So we presented female top leaders to people and then had them do the IAT test before and afterwards, and we showed that their association, think manager, think male, was a little bit reduced after we have presented them with successful female women. And I think this should also be done on a societal level in newspapers, etc. Maybe the last statement, and then I would like to move on. Yes, please.
I don't have anything against the cascade system, you suppose, but wouldn't the total equality system thought through mean that on each level of each firm we'd had to search for in our society like 15% of Turks and so on and so on, and that this search in reality would simply be impossible. And secondly, isn't it also a fact that there are some, of course not all, but some, I'm missing a word, some abilities that men are on average more capable of. So that would mean that there are actually jobs that on average men might be more capable of. And wouldn't it be insane to have a quota for these? And vice versa? Yeah. I'm just thinking, of course, physically, men on average are physically stronger. So when for example, building houses and no woman would complain that there isn't a quota for female house builders because men are more capable of it. But let me give you an example. I was in a workshop with diversity experts, and one of these experts gave us an example about training IKEA. IKEA, for a couple of years ago, developed a new diversity strategy, and they had workshops in many of their production plants and in their shopping centers, etc. And one example, there were two examples that I found very interesting. One example was they had a couple coming in who were deaf. They couldn't hear. And then someone in the sales room remembered that there was also a deaf employee somewhere in the production facilities. So this employee was called in to help translate with sign language. And I think this was in Siegen. And because this idea worked so well, they implemented one day in a month, I think it was the first Wednesday of every month, where they got several translators, and this became famous, and deaf people from all over Germany went there to do their IKEA shopping in this store in Siegen because they were helped and their purposes were served. So, no, we don't need a quota for deaf persons on every level of the organization's hierarchy. But if there's more diversity in our organizations, universities, etc., this sometimes would also help us serving needs that we otherwise don't see. We would not normally think that, yes, it would be good to have a deaf person in every department because there's no need for it. But once we do have more diversity, we would see that we can serve other needs and purposes, and maybe this would get some positive effects that we don't know before. The other example also with IKEA was, I don't, Lager. Does someone know the word for Lager? storage, yeah, maybe storage. In an IKEA store, on the storage, in the storage department, the first woman was appointed. And everyone was against her because she was not so physically strong. And the man thought, oh, if we have this female colleague from next month on, we may have to do more work because she can obviously not lift the heavy cases and so on. And this was indeed what happened. The women said, oh, I'm sorry, I cannot lift this heavy case. I'm too weak for that. So what they came up with was a system of Flaschenzüge, a system of technical equipment that helped the women lifting the heavy equipment. And after a very short time, the men were also using that. And this was for their own benefit because their backs were not hurt so much. And this store had a much lower absenteeism rate. So again, of course, women are physically, on average, not as strong as men. It does not apply to every woman. So obviously, there are women who could do every job because they are as strong as men. But sometimes it's also good to see demands or needs or how can you solve problems that benefit the majority that wouldn't know otherwise. Okay? And now I think I have 92 slides left. So I should talk a little faster today. Intergroup behavior. Last session before Christmas and after Christmas we continue with aggression. I don't go through some of the slides today. Some can also be summarized. Intergroup behavior can be defined as any behavior that is influenced by group members' perception of an outgroup. But we will cover some topics today that are not about in-group, out-group differences in particular. So at the beginning we talk about relative deprivation, and then we move to several forms of cooperation, dilemmas, etc., before we move on to theories of intergroup behavior. Relative deprivation is a relative old concept, a traditional concept that has been researched from the 1940s, 50s onwards, and that helped explain why sometimes people were hostile against each other, and particularly groups were hostile against each other, and because why there was prejudice. Group members may engage in collective protest to the extent that they subjectively feel deprived as a group relative to their aspirations or to other groups. So relative deprivation can happen both on an individual level. I can feel deprived relative to other individuals, or we as a group are underprivileged in comparison with another group. On some slide later, we say that this happened in the early 1960s in the US with the civil rights movement. Up until then, black people were only comparing themselves with other black people, and then they experienced some individual deprivation. But collective relative deprivation was only developed or became salient or more widespread when, because of slight progress in the American society, slight changes in the rules, regulations, and law system, blacks started comparing themselves with whites, and that made the large underprivilegation salient. And Berkowitz in 1972 looked at some race riots, and he came up with a long, hot summer explanation of collective violence. So black people in particularly felt relatively deprived to what they thought they deserved in comparison to the whites, who were much more privileged, had more access to resources, etc. That led to frustration, and frustration on a collective level. So whole groups, every individual in whole groups and neighborhoods were frustrated. And this was amplified by aversive environmental conditions. So for example,
in this case, a heat wave in the early 1970s. I don't know who of you has ever been in the United States. If you are in the south of the United States, Alabama, Virginia, Louisiana, in the summer it can get really, really hot there. And at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, there was no widespread air conditioning, for example. So in the summer, you really experience temperature of well over 40 degrees Celsius without the luxury equipment that we have today. So it can get really, really hot. And this amplifies people's frustration. Then some individuals start acting aggressively, and these individual acts of aggression are amplified again by some aggressive stimuli. For example, armed police getting into the neighborhood. And then aggression becomes more widespread, it becomes a dominant response, and it spreads rapidly through social facilitation processes, as we have discussed 3 weeks ago. And this leads to collective violence. So relative deprivation in combination with aversive conditions, environmental conditions, can lead to collective violence. Let us now go into some theories and some fundamentals of understanding cooperation and conflict between groups. Conflict is a situation that occurs when it is perceived by the parties involved, so typically 2 parties, sometimes more parties, sometimes it's 2 individuals, sometimes it's 2 groups, that gains made by the other party automatically decreases their own chances of getting the rewards, and therefore that goals are incompatible. The result of such perceived conflict is almost always competition. These are attempts by each party to gain as many of the limited rewards as possible and to reduce the likelihood of success for the other party. So almost every time when we perceive conflict, that there's a zero-sum game and we have incompatible goals, we try to get as much of the resources as we can and automatically reduce the chances or opportunities for success for the other party. Sometimes conflict is realistic when the goals of both parties really are incompatible. So, for example, at a sporting event, when 2 football teams fight each other, only one team can win the final cup. Sometimes conflicts, however, are more perceived than realistic. They are based on misperceptions of intentions of the other party or the nature of the potential reward. The classic textbook example for this is 2 brothers are fighting over 1 orange. Both brothers want to have the orange and are fiercely arguing with each other and fighting each other. So what does the mother observing this do? She cuts the orange in half and gives 1/2 of the orange to each of the brothers. They go away. One brother throws away the orange meat and uses the peeling to cook some orange marmalade. The other brother peels it off and throws the peeling away to use the juice and eat it or drink it. So there's a misperception of the intention of both brothers, what they wanted to do with the outcome. If they had revealed their intentions, if they had talked about their interests, we would leave this zero-sum game and come to a win-win situation. And this is easily said, but difficult to do. And in management trainings, this is something that I often emphasize and where I also have people role play on some typical work conflict situations. And what we typically don't do is we don't try to get to the other party's interests. Johnson and others have conducted meta-analyses of literally hundreds of studies that compared groups that worked in cooperative or competitive atmospheres, and they found that members of cooperative groups reported more positive attitudes, more effective learning, and on average better performance in comparison to groups that are more competitive. Sometimes, however,
conflict within groups can also stimulate innovation and creativity. So sometimes conflict can be good. There seems to be an optimal level of conflict, but this is only due in very specific circumstances. So please don't go away from this lecture and think that conflict can be good. Conflict is only good in very narrow, specific circumstances. Sometimes when there is task conflict about non-routine tasks, and at the same time there's no relationship conflict between people, then there seems to be an inverted U-shaped curve that a little bit of conflict can help stimulate creativity and innovation. But as soon as we fight about routine tasks, as soon as we have too high conflict levels about tasks that are non-routine, and as soon as we have relationship conflicts between people because of different personalities, attitudes, etc., this almost always leads to negative outcomes, lower satisfaction, lower performance, lower cohesion, etc. Now, we can study this by looking at public goods or public goods dilemmas. Public goods are benefits that are shared by a community at large. Everyone in the group has access to them, regardless of whether or not they have personally contributed. Local schools, universities, medical research, everyone has access to it, even if we do not individually contribute to it. For example, schools and universities are typically built by the tax money from people's parents, but school children do not contribute to schools themselves. We do not contribute to hospitals. Even if we don't pay taxes, we can go to a doctor or to a hospital and we are treated, at least in Germany. These are typical examples of public goods, and public goods can be examples of conflicts. And Hardin has called this the commons dilemma. The commons was historically a pasture that was centrally located in European towns, and it was used for local inhabitants to graze their livestock on. Cows, for example, or sheep. But the commons were not always wisely used, because sometimes each individual wanted to be able to use the common to graze their own animals and many animals as possible, but this led to the commons being overgrazed and destroyed in the midterm or in the long term. And here the basic dilemma is that individual needs and public needs, or the needs of the groups, are often in conflict with each other. So for an individual, using as much of the common would be the maximizing strategy. For a group, using it more wisely and limiting the individual access would be better. We can also call that a social dilemma, situation in which the goals of the individual conflict with the goals of the group. And again, the personally beneficial choice, using water during water shortage, for example, produces benefits for the individuals, irrespective of what the others do. But the paradox is that if everyone would use this strategy, then the water table would be depleted, and it would be to everyone's disadvantage. Okay? I don't know whether you can imagine, but I think it's not that long ago. We had a relatively hot summer here in Hessia 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when people were told not to use water to sprinkle their lawns. But still you see some people doing it, irrespectively of what the law says or what the newspapers say or what others do, because they prefer a green lawn. And when just 1 or 2 or 5 individuals do that, that's not a problem. But if everyone would think egoistically and only on their individual benefits, the water table would be depleted and we would have much more severe problems. We can also differentiate between harvesting and contributions dilemmas. Harvesting dilemmas are the ones that I've just explained. So when we use more from the public goods, then the public goods provides for everyone. Contributions dilemma are when short-term costs of a behavior lead individuals to avoid performing it. donating money or donating to or making efforts. Fachschaften, for example, in the university, if every one of you would contribute 1 or 2 hours of your time in a given week, the Fachschaft would probably work very effectively. But because most people do not want this, and the Fachschaft comprises maybe only 10 people who have to put in all the work. And if they don't like it to do it anymore, then there would be no Fachschaft, and it would be negative for everyone in the long term. How can we study this in the laboratory? And a number of tasks have been developed. Rappaport came up with the matrix games, and I will show you the prisoner's dilemma as one example of such a matrix game that was used by Luce and Reifer. Imagine you are one of 2 prisoners. You are either Malik or Frank. The police caught you and accuses you of a crime. If none of you confesses the crime, then the police can has only evidence to convict you of a minor offense. And now they offer you a reduced sentence if you would confess. So you are Malik, for example, and the other one is Frank. If Malik does confess and Frank isn't confessing, Malik would get off free, 0 years in prison. Frank would get 30 years in prison. If both confess, both would earn 10 years. So 30 years would be the maximum prison time. 10 years would be the reduced sentence offered by the police for everyone who is confessing and helping them. But if both don't confess, the police can only convict them because of a minor offense, so both would get away with 3 years in prison. Now, what would be rational? You cannot communicate with Frank. He's sitting in another prison cell. You are in front of the police officer, and it's your decision now. And whether you confess or not. Rationally, if Malik does not confess, he either gets 3 years when Frank doesn't also not confess, and not confessing here in this setup is cooperation. Not confessing means Frank and Malik cooperate, because that would give them, as a group, the lowest number of years in prison. So not confessing is cooperation, confessing is competing with the other prisoner. So rationally, Malik should not confess because, rationally Malik should confess because irrespectively of what Frank does, confessing gets him the lower number of years in prison. If Malik confesses and tells the police what they want to hear, Malik would either get 0 years when Frank does cooperate with him, but he isn't, or it would get him 10 years in prison when Frank also confesses. If Malik does not confess, cooperates with Frank, he would get into prison for 3 years instead of 0, or he would get into prison for 30 years instead of 10. Okay? So individually, both parties are motivated not to cooperate. As a group, they should cooperate because that gets them the lowest number of years in prison. So the group outcome would be most positive here when both would cooperate, but because the numbers in the matrix are made in a way that competition is better as an individual motive, in these games we often see less cooperation than we would imagine. And these games can be used in multitude ways. So we can adjust the numbers in this table. We can have more than 2 parties. We can either allow the parties to communicate or not. Typically, when we allow them to communicate, we see more cooperation than when they have to make individual choices, and so on and so forth. It's a nice way of studying this conflict or perceived conflict in the laboratory and to observe people's behaviors. this is just what I just explained. And another experiment by Deutsch and Krauss, they used the trucking game. Each participant was given $4, and with a little truck you have to drive, ACME has to drive from their starting position to their destination. And they earn, whatever it was, 60 cents when they reach their destination, minus 2 cents for every second it takes driving to the destination. And they can either use the one-lane fast route, or they can use the long alternative winding route. And this is so long and takes so long that every time ACME would need to take this route, they lose a little bit of money. And both can the same, from start to destination. Now, what Deutsch and Krauss manipulated was whether there were no gates, or whether there was just one gate for either ACME or Bolt, or because both parties had a gate. And the result was, when there was no gate, they quickly learned to cooperate, and they made a little bit of profit. When one party had a gate, they made a loss, but when both parties had a gate, they made a large loss. You see that they lost even more than the $4 that were originally paid to them. And now I would like to briefly show you a real-world example of how we can use these cooperation games outside of the laboratory, because you can criticize that people playing these games in laboratories might behave completely different in the laboratory than they would in the real world. This is research by Devesh Rustagi, Stefanie Engel, and Michael Kosfeld.
Just one question going back to the trucking game.
Mm-hmm.
How were they able to make faults, or what was the consequence?
They could close. So when this gate was controlled by ACME, ACME could close the gate to, for example, punish Bolt for using the one-lane road when ACME just wanted to use it. And when both had a gate, what happened was that they were closing the road all the time to punish the other party. And they didn't communicate with each other and found a way of using the one-lane road in alternating.
But how were they losing money?
So every time for each second it took them for a trip, they had to pay 1 cent operating cost. So they earned 60 cents for each successful trip, but lost 1 cent for each second. So if they took it longer to them than 60 seconds, they would lose money on every trip. And this is what happened in the bilateral threat condition when there were two games. So here they overall made a profit. Here they lost some money, but overall they were still keeping some of their original $4. Here they lost a lot of money. Okay, Devesh Rustagi is now a junior professor here at Goethe University in the economics department, where Michael Kosfeld is also a professor of management and macroeconomics. And they did their research together with Stefanie Engel in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, there's a lot of problems with droughts, and the German GIZ or GTZ at that time, the German Technische Gesellschaft für technische Zusammenarbeit, now it's Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, helped with forest programs. So there's a high deforestation rates, about 16 square kilometers of forest are lost each year, and past attempts to protect these forests through centrally administered programs had failed. And in 2000, the GTZ launched a new participatory forest management program. I don't go into the details here, but there were about 50 different user societies, 50 different communities of Omoro people, on average 16 to 30 members in each of these communities. only these members have access to a specific aspect of the forest and could use it as fuel wood or as timber material or to sell it on the market. The outcome measure of the GEZ was potential crop trees. These are trees that are about 2 meters high, because if people allow a tree to grow 2 meters and higher, there's a likelihood that this tree will not be cut but can fully grow, fully grow, and this would be a success rate for this program. There was a problem, a collective action problem, and free rider incentives. So what does the members do? They need to have an eye on their forest. They need to maintain their forest. They need to go on patrols at nighttime to make sure that no other user societies come and cut the trees. So they have to make some investments. And there's an incentive for free riders not to participate in the patrols at nighttime, because it would be individual effort that would not be paid. Now, what Kosfeld and colleagues found was there was large variation in this outcome measure, potential crop trees. The minimum in one society was 13, the maximum was 162 numbers of trees in a given area. And the question was, what did cause this PCT variation? And they looked at variables like topography, size of the groups, access to the markets, how far were the markets away, some social and economic variables, etc. But the question was, are there also some social preference differences between the user societies? And what they did to determine social preferences was they played social dilemma games with the people living in these communities. Each player received 6 Ethiopian birr, that's about 1 daily wage, to play with. So they were individually invited and they were given 6 birr and said, we would like to do a little play with you. You can contribute to a public good, and you are playing with another player who is sitting in the next room. And there were real players, but they didn't see each other, they couldn't communicate with each other, they remained anonymous. This is the payoff matrix. If you give your full 6 birr, that would be 6 minus your investment, 0, plus 75% of your 6 plus whatever the other party gave. If the other party would also give 6, that would be 6 plus 6 is 12 times 0.75, that would be 9. Oh yeah, and that is what you would get. that would be your outcome. So you would get 9 birr. 3 more than you invested, which is good, isn't it? But what happens when the other party doesn't give anything? 6 minus your 6 is 0. 75% of your 6 plus nothing else. So you would get 4? Less than what you invested. If the other party would only give 1 or 2, you might get your 6 birrs back, but no more than that. So individually, it's a little bit like in the prisoner dilemmas game. Individually, for you, it would be good to give nothing. Because if you would get 0, then you would get 6. You keep your own 6, plus 75% of the other parties, whatever he or she gives. And if it's only 1, then you would still get your 6 plus 0.75. If the other party gives 2 or 3 or 4, you would keep your own 6 minus your 0, plus 75% of whatever the other party gives. So as an individual, you may be motivated to not give much of many of your beers into the game. You would benefit exclusively from what the other party gives you, and you would keep your own 6 beer. If both parties would cooperate and give their full amount, it would be best for both parties. And Kosfeld and others call people who invest all their money unconditional cooperators, because they only play once. They don't know about the other party's preference. They don't know about the other player's attitudes. If they give their full 6 beers, they are unconditional cooperators. So they have an assumption that cooperation is good. Some people would free ride and give as little as possible and hope that they benefit from the other party. And some people are altruists, they always contribute everything. Some people are conditional cooperators. Sorry, I got it slightly wrong. Some people are conditional cooperators. They contribute more the more the other party, the other player contributes. 670 subjects were observed from 49 different forest user societies. This is one society. This is an altruist who always cooperates. This might be a conditional cooperator. He only gives if he knows the other party also gives. And this is not a free rider. This is Devesh Rustagi, who is now working here at Goethe University. This is a distribution of preferences. So about 34% of the people, of the player, were conditional cooperators. 231 gave the more money, the more they expected the other party to give. Only 15, only 2% were altruists, and 10 or 11% were free riders. I don't know what the others are. And this is a relationship between the proportion of conditional cooperators in every group and the size of the crop trees, or the number of crop trees. And there's this linear, significant, and substantial relationship between these two measures. So I think this is a very nice example of that our little games that we typically play in the laboratory can actually help us identifying people's preferences, and that we can conclude that these people would probably also behave differently in the real world when we make these little arbitrary games in the laboratory. And you know that as psychologists, we typically even don't give people real money. So it's about points and things. And I will show you some examples later on of research that has been done that only uses arbitrary things, no money. But when money is involved, like here, people's preferences in the little game predict a really important outcome for the communities. And Kosfeld and colleagues did find that this was due to societies with higher proportions of conditional cooperators and lower proportions of free riders were ready to invest more of their time to look after the forest. Yes, please.
What scale of, I don't know, the number looks like 23 for the one and between 19 and 38 for the second.
Yeah.
I'm referring to. These look like there are more free riders than cooperators on the whole. I know this is only a one-shot game, so this was only once measured, but could a society like this actually exist and survive?
You mean the ones in which you have higher bars of green free riders than red bars?
Higher bars?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, maybe they can, maybe they don't have other goals that they have to mutually accomplish. The trees, the forests are not the only thing that is relevant to them. Maybe there are individual farmers who only have to look after their animals and there's maybe not so much cooperation necessary. But you see that for the forest program, there's this link. I don't go through more of the details here. You see that free riders are negatively related to the outcome. Conditional cooperators, the more they are, the more crop trees, market distance, time to the market, these things did play a role. Female share, for example, was not significant. So whether there are more female Forest User Society members or not, it didn't matter. Okay, let me go through one or two classic important theories. The first theory that social scientists, social psychologists came up with to explain why there's prejudice and why there are intergroup conflicts and hostility was realistic group conflict theory. They said that people fight each other because they fight for material resources. And whenever material resources are limited, we see conflict. And conflict sometimes can mean war or genocide. And Mustafa Sherif, who was of Turkish origin, did famous studies in the 1960s, the so-called robbers' cave studies that led to the formulation of this realistic group conflict theory. Mustafa Sherif and his team studied behavior of 11-year-old white boys in summer camps. The boys were divided into two groups, rattlers on the one hand, eagles on the other hand, and then the researchers introduced some competition. So, example, a tug-of-war game, and only the winning group, the winning team, would get some highly attractive material resources. So, for example, pocket knives. Pocket knives, of course, for 11-year-old boys are an attractive price, an attractive reward, and only one group could win the reward. It was a scarce, limited resources. And what they found was that soon after these competitions were introduced, the groups started fighting each other. So negative perceptions on the part of each group developed. Overt hostility quickly followed. They were stealing each other's flags. They were calling each other's names. They were throwing food at each other at lunch and breakfast. So this was so-called proof of Mustafa Sherif's idea that whenever you bring groups in contact, there will be conflict for material resources. What they also found, and I will talk about this later, what they also found, even without the material resources, they already saw signs of conflict once the groups had been established. In the second phase or third phase of the experiment, Sherif wanted to see how we can resolve this conflict, and he introduced superordinate goals. Here the boys had to work together to solve a series of problems. For example, the truck that brought the food's lunch got stuck in the mud, or the truck had a problem and brought some film machine for a video. It wasn't a video in the 1960s, but a film that the boys wanted to see, and the truck got stuck somewhere. And Mustafa Sherif himself sat in the driver's cabin and stood on the brakes of the truck. And he stood on the brakes of the truck, unknowingly for the boys, of course, unless boys of all teams, of both the Rattlers and the Eagles, helped to push the truck out of the mud. So they had a superordinate goal, and the result was some reduction in hostility between the groups and some more positive intergroup attitudes. So Sherif concluded from this that whenever there are fights for scarce resources, conflict arises. Whenever there are superordinate goals that the two teams can only accomplish together, conflict can be reduced. The social identity approach, yes, please.
I heard already about this experiment. I think it was so hostility was reduced only when they succeeded at a task, because otherwise they would blame the other group.
That's a good comment. So Sherif obviously set up this in a way that they always succeeded. But you are right. Of course, when two groups have a mutually interdependent goal that they only can achieve together, and when they fail to achieve this goal, this can also have detrimental effects. Yes, thank you. What social identity researchers in the 1970s thought was maybe the limited resources aren't necessary because, as I mentioned, Sharif and his team already observed some hostility simply after they have put the boys into one of the two groups, without even introducing resources and competition. So social identity researchers claimed that social categorization, categorizing people into groups, may be the only necessary precondition for being a group and engaging in intergroup behavior. So as soon as people start identifying with a category, we may already see intergroup behavior. And this self-categorization is then the process responsible for psychologically identifying with a group and then behaving as a group member. So we conform to the group norms, we stereotype people who do not belong to our group, ethnocentrism, in-group solidarity, and I think, as I already told you in the lecture on self and identity, we have a need for self-esteem. And our self-esteem is partly drawn from our membership in social groups, and we always try to gain positive social identity, and sometimes we can gain this from positively distinguishing our group from other groups. Now, we are, of course, members of many different social categories at every given time. So how can we determine which of the categories become salient, important for the people's minds? And we can look at the, at the situation, and we can look at the person. We are more likely to categorize people using categories that are salient, meaning that they are immediately apparent when we see someone. Ethnic groups, gender, age, these are apparent categories, whereas personality differences, for example, are less easy to detect. Categories are salient also when they are solos. One woman in a group of 5 is more salient than 3 women in a group of 6 people. One man in a psychology course is more salient than a woman in a psychology course, and it's just the opposite if you would go to an engineering department. And we are more easy to categorize people into these groups when they are salient. Also, characteristics of the individual are important. People vary in the categories that they find important. Some categories are more accessible to us because we use them more often. For example, members of minority groups find ethnicity more important than members of the majority because they experience that they are a member of a specific group more often than people from the majority. And categorization has important outcomes for the individuals. Thinking about others in terms of their social category has benefits for the person who does the categorizing. It makes our life easier. It helps us making fast decisions, who to trust, who to cooperate with. But it has negative effects on those who are categorized, as we have seen in the experiments of Klink and Wagner. Simply being in the group that is categorized as an ethnic outgroup has negative effects because they don't get access to little help or flats or lifts home, etc., etc. And I would like to show you first an experiment by Taschel and colleagues. These are the so-called minimal group studies. Henri Taschel and colleagues in 1971 also invited 11-year-old boys in England to the laboratory. In one condition, for example, they showed them a picture with thousands of little dots, and they asked them individually to estimate the number of dots. And then they randomly told half of the boys that they were underestimators, and half of the group were told that they are overestimators. That was everything. In another experiment, they used pictures of Klee and Kandinsky. The boys didn't know who Klee and Kandinsky was. They showed them a series of pictures and asked each boy how much they liked these pictures. And then, again, randomly, they divided half of the boys into the group they told they are Kandinsky supporters, and the other group were told you are lovers of pictures of Klee. And then they asked the boys individually. They didn't know who was in their in-group. They didn't know who was in their out-group. They asked them individually to divide little points or coins or amounts of money between one person of their own group and one person of the other group. They didn't know who it was. They only knew that when they gave money to the in-group member, it couldn't be themselves. So they couldn't give money to themselves, but it was some individual from their own group they didn't know and some individual from the out group they didn't know. And they had to do it on matrices like this. Let's look first at matrix number 2. So you can decide now if you would give 18 cents to your own in-group member, which would mean 5 cents to the out-group member. Or 16 cents in-group member, 7 cents out-group member. Or 10 cents in-group member, 13 cents out-group member. What most people do in these experiments, they try to aim for fairness. So 30–40% of all boys try to take the middle category and give both groups roughly the same. In some of these matrices, they had the opportunity to give both in-group and out-group members the highest amounts, which would be maximum joint profits. Both get a lot, and this would be the clever strategy because it's the experimenter's money. Or they had the opportunity to give their own group member more than to the out group. And this is also what happened quite regularly. So they favored their in-group, maximum in-group profit. So in this matrix 2, they would not take anywhere between 10 and 6 for their own group and more points or money for the other group member, but they would choose somewhere along this side of the scale, which you may call rational. Because if you expect that everyone is doing the same, it's rational to give more money to the other in-group member than to the out-group member, hoping that your other in-group members would do the same and that you would also benefit from it eventually. What is not rational is what happened in matrices like the one above. Here again, you have the opportunity to act fair, give both parties 13 cents, or you have the opportunity to gain a lot for your own group member, 16, 17, 18, 19, but that would also mean that the person from the out group would get slightly more than the person from the in group. And this is what people try to avoid. In a matrix like this, what we find is that many boys who are not acting fairly rather tend to tick somewhere here, so they are happy with their in-group member making less money than they could, as long as they get more money than the other person, the out-group member. And this is not rational. This can only be interpreted by some psychological mechanism, and this mechanism Taschler and Turner and others called in-group favoritism. So we have a positive need for self-esteem, or a need for positive self-esteem. The only distinction we can make is in-group, out-group. We don't know anything else about the group, so the only way we can draw positive social identity from being a member of the overestimators or the Kandinsky group is to distinguish our group positively from the other group. And this can be done by giving our own group member more than the other group, even if it does mean less absolute gain or profit. This is one aspect of social identity theory, and I think it's pretty simple and pretty clear. We have a need for positive self-esteem. We draw our self-esteem from being individuals, from our personal identity as individual people with our unique strengths and positive attributes. But we also gain positive self-esteem from being members of social groups, and this is our social identity. And when there are no other criteria, no other possibilities, like in the minimal group paradigm, we do gain positive identity from discriminating against the out-group and favoring the in-group. Social identity theory was developed by Taschler and Turner, however, to also determine why is there so much injustice in our world and what are the conditions that make people cope with that injustice, and what are the conditions that make people stand up and protest and engage in collective action. And this is the theory in a nutshell. The next 6 or 7 slides just explain this figure, and I will explain it to you now. We can have, or according to Taschler and colleagues, we have a social belief system. We can either think that there's social mobility or that there's no social mobility. This depends on the group's boundaries, permeability. If we think that group boundaries are permeable and we can become a member of the other group, then we have a tendency to individual mobility, so we exit our own group and move into the other high status group. Some groups are permeable, so we can find it grossly unfair that managers own more than employees if we are employees. But we may have the social belief system that there is social mobility. The groups are permeable. I can become a manager if I do extra courses, if I go on an MBA course, if I work particularly hard, and eventually I can be promoted and I can become a manager. Okay? So I will, if I do have this belief system, I will respond with individual mobility and I will try to leave my own group and move into the high status group. Sometimes group boundaries are not permeable, they are impermeable. Women can hardly become men and vice versa. Black people cannot become white and vice versa. These are categories that are very difficult to change unless in very specific circumstances. And sometimes it's not about reality, it's about perceptions. Amelie Mummendier, Andreas Klink, and some other colleagues in the mid-1990s did a lot of research with East Germans, for example. People from East Germany at that time were asked whether they had a belief system for permeability or impermeability. Some East Germans said, oh yes, the boundaries between West and East Germany are completely permeable. I can pack my stuff together tomorrow and move to Hamburg, from Jena to Hamburg, take a job there and take a flat there, and I become a Wessi, so to speak. Other people said, no, it's completely, it's as if the wall would still be there. I will never be able to move to West Germany because I lack the qualification, I fear prejudice and stereotyping, etc. So for some people, permeability was a subjective reality. For other people, impermeability was a subjective reality. This is important to keep in mind. Permeability is not an objective, or not always an objective. So what happens if people perceive the group boundaries are impermeable? They can have one of two possible belief systems for social change again. They can either think that there are cognitive alternatives or that there are no cognitive alternatives. This depends on whether they see the situation as legitimate and stable. As long as we think, oh, it's legitimate that some people earn more and others earn less, or that it's legitimate that some people are of royal blood. The typical question I sometimes ask students in the exams in Marburg, when we could look at the castle of Marburg from the department. Why was it that for 500 years and more, we accepted, or people tolerated, that some people were living a life in luxury and others were barely able to survive? because they found it highly legitimate. It was God's will that some people with royal blood lived in a different situation than ordinary people would live. And they also considered the situation as highly stable. Only when Luther came and challenged the situation, the Bauernkriege developed and so on, people gained an understanding that it may not be legitimate and it may also not be as stable as people believed for hundreds of years. And if people believe that it's illegitimate and unstable, people start believing there should be alternatives. We can believe that we can be the masters and they can be in the lower status position. And then they start social competition, and we saw that in the civil rights activity movement. Some terrorists believed in this system. Revolutions typically are led by people who have this belief system. When there are no cognitive alternatives, when we think, okay, group boundaries are not permeable and the situation is to some extent legitimate and quite stable, we start engaging in social creativity. Either new dimensions of intergroup comparison. So in the research by Amelie Momendai and colleagues, they found that East Germans knew that they were of lower status as long as they were compared on economic dimensions. Yes, the West Germans make more money, earn more money, drive the faster cars, whatever. So they look for new dimensions of comparison. And East Germans started emphasizing things that were typical for East Germany. Yeah, but we have a better social cohesion, or we are more environmentally concerned. We, things like this. Redefining the value of existing dimensions. So, for example, saying that, yes, they are better in economic terms, but economics is not everything. We have higher goals in our life than just making a lot of money. Or by comparisons with other outgroups. Yes, economically we are slightly worse off than the West Germans, but we are much better than the Poles. So, alternative comparison groups. This is what's on the next 6 or 7 slides. So it's all on these slides what I just explained. And impermeability, stability, instability, and illegitimate are determinants of social change. A crowd is a collection of a large number of individuals who come together in a common place for a common purpose. Football matches, protests, political rallies. And in most cases, crowds are harmless. Every weekend there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of people going to football matches. Sometimes crowds, however, turn into a mob, which is some individuals are acting violently, harming property, or others injuring themselves or other people. When and why does this happen? How come that sometimes harmless crowds turn into violent mobs? It happens when the relevant social norms break down. So typically we all follow the norm for not physically violating property or individuals. But in these situations, sometimes these norms change. This can be called de-individuations. Individuals act on their own accord and wanted to gain whatever they think is valuable. But however, the norms of the crowd are also still strong and important for the mob, but they are different norms, as has been shown by political party activities, by riots. They develop their own norms for being particularly aggressive to the police, and then this norm emphasizes or amplifies individual behavior. And one research that I found very interesting and shocking is Leon Mann. Leon Mann in 1980 found a newspaper article of a mob gathering on the pavement of a tall building, and on the top of the tall building a suicidal jumper was standing. And after a while the mob started cheering and shouting, "Jump, jump, jump." And then Leon Mann did a more thorough test, and in the media, I think he found some 30 accounts of suicidal jumpers and a mob present. And in about half or 2/3 of the incidents, he found this behavior present. And what he found was this was more likely when the situation happened at night, so when there was darkness. It was more likely when there was a higher distance, when the building was taller, so that there was more anonymity between the one standing on top of the building and the crowd. And it was more likely the larger the crowd was. I would like to conclude with one statement how we can reduce prejudice, how we can reduce hostility. And Gordon Allport developed contact theory or contact hypothesis. Gordon Allport said that whenever we bring people in contact with people from the other group, this helps reducing prejudice and hostility. Allport also said this is more likely when 6 conditions are met. When they mutually engage, when there's interdependence in the goals they want to achieve, when they have a common goal, when there's equal status of the group members in the contact situation, when there's interpersonal contact, not just contact on an abstract group level, when there's multiple contacts with members of the group, and when the contact is supported by authority or when there are social norms in place. This, for example, is typically true for school settings. So there are typically social norms, and it's supported by the teachers. They have common goals. When there's group work, they have common goals that they can interdependently achieve. In this situation, they are typically of equal status, and they sit together individually and can have opportunities for interpersonal contact. Pettigrew and Tropp a couple of years ago published a meta-analysis that summarized more than 500 studies with more than 250,000 participants, and they found a small but substantial correlation that indeed prejudice was negatively related to contact or contact negatively related to prejudice. They also found that the conditions by Allport do not need to be met. They are facilitating conditions but not necessary conditions. Contact works because of more information that we gain. It also works because it decreases our anxiety that we have about people from the other group, and it may change the social norms in the groups so that expressing negative beliefs are less and less appropriate. What we did in our research in Marburg was developing this model. We said we need to have distal contact opportunities. We need to have more people, for example, from ethnic groups in our neighborhoods, work, or classroom, because that provides the opportunity for making more proximal contact, having acquaintances or close friends from this group. And then we see that our contact is more and more important, and this will lead to reductions of prejudice. And we did find this in a number of studies, and we could also explain why there is more prejudice against Turkish people, for example, in East Germany than in West Germany, because there are far fewer Turks living in the neighborhoods or attending schools. This reduces the likelihood that East Germans make friends or have acquaintances from the other group, and this leads to more antipathy. And what we also did in some experiments, in some studies, we tried to see, is it contact reducing prejudice, or are the less prejudiced people the ones who engage in more contact? So what is the hen and what is the egg? What is the cause and what is the effect? What we found in almost every study in which we looked is both paths are significant, but the path from contact to prejudice was typically stronger than the path in the opposite direction. And now we have done some studies in which we brought people into contact and we have evaluated this, and we have found that contact indeed helps reducing prejudice. And one important message, Ulrich Wagner and their colleagues have done some analysis over the last 10 years with the data from the group-related enmity project that I showed you last week, what they found is there's a linear positive effect between the number of ethnic minority groups living in Germany's districts and negative attitude, positive attitudes. So the more ethnic minorities there are, the better are the attitudes of the majority. It's a linear trend. There's no such thing as a threshold or no such thing as a miracle or a number that is too much or too many. So the message from this contact research is that by and large, contact is good. And we as social scientists should promote contact and we should foster contact wherever we work. This was the last statement. I wish you a Merry Christmas and good start in 2014 and see you back in January. Thank you.